The words hit me like a carefully calculated punch to the professional gut. Overqualified and threatening. That's how Marcus described me to the regional director during what he thought was a private phone conversation. I happened to be walking past his office when I heard my name, and something about the tone made me pause. 3 years of 90-hour weeks, 3 years of revenue numbers that made the quarterly reports look like victory parades, 3 years of pulling his department out of every crisis imaginable. Overqualified and threatening. The irony wasn't lost on me. In corporate speak, overqualified typically means expensive, and threatening usually translates to someone who makes their superiors look incompetent by comparison. I'd suspected this conversation was coming for months. The signs had been there, subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd learned to read corporate tea leaves the hard way. But here's the thing about being genuinely overqualified in your position. You tend to see several moves ahead, like a chess player who's been studying the board while everyone else is still learning the rules. As I stood there listening to Marcus paint me as some kind of workplace liability, I was already 3 steps into my contingency plan. Let me back up and give you the full picture of how I'd spent the last 3 years building something that was apparently too successful for my own good. I joined Meridian Solutions in 2021 as a senior business analyst, technically reporting to Marcus Chen, who held the title of Operations Director. The company specialized in supply chain optimization for mid-tier manufacturing clients, and when I arrived, their success rate was hovering around 62%. Not terrible, but not exactly the kind of number that keeps executives sleeping soundly. My background was admittedly more extensive than what the position required. I'd spent 8 years at McKinsey working on enterprise transformation projects, followed by 2 years as an independent consultant helping Fortune 500 companies restructure their operational frameworks. The Meridian job represented a significant step down in terms of prestige and salary, but it offered something I'd been craving: the opportunity to build something from the ground up instead of constantly fixing other people's strategic mistakes. Marcus had been effusive during the interview process. He spoke about vision and growth potential, about how someone with my background could help elevate the entire department. He painted a picture of partnership, of collaborative leadership that would benefit everyone involved. I should have paid more attention to the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he talked about my consulting experience. The first 6 months were exactly what I'd hoped for. I dove into the existing client portfolios, analyzed their operational data, and began identifying patterns that the previous analysts had missed. Manufacturing inefficiencies that were costing clients millions annually. Supply chain bottlenecks that could be resolved with relatively simple technological integrations. Quality control gaps that were creating downstream compliance issues. I documented everything meticulously, created comprehensive reports, and presented my findings to Marcus with detailed implementation strategies. His response was consistently enthusiastic, full of praise for my thorough analysis and innovative thinking. He'd take my reports to his meetings with senior leadership and return with stories about how impressed everyone was with the quality of our departmental output. The results spoke for themselves. Our client success rate climbed to 74% by the end of my first year, and our client retention rate improved from 68% to 87%. More importantly, the average value of our client contracts increased by 32% as we demonstrated our ability to deliver measurable operational improvements. I assumed this success would translate into the kind of recognition and advancement opportunities that Marcus had hinted at during the hiring process. I was wrong. The first warning sign came during my annual review. Marcus spent considerable time praising my performance, calling me the most valuable analyst the department had ever had. He spoke glowingly about my contribution to the team's success and the positive feedback he'd received from senior leadership about our improved numbers. Then he delivered the news that my salary increase would be 2.5%, barely above the cost of living adjustment that everyone received automatically. When I asked about advancement opportunities, Marcus became notably evasive. He spoke in vague terms about organizational structure and timing, about how these decisions were made at levels well above his pay grade. He assured me that my contributions were being noticed and that patience would be rewarded, but he couldn't offer any specific timeline or commitments. I left that meeting with a distinct feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our working relationship, though I couldn't quite identify what it was. Marcus continued to be professionally cordial, continued to praise my work, continued to present my analysis to senior leadership as departmental achievements. But there was a subtle distance that hadn't been there before, a formality that suggested I was being managed rather than mentored. The second year brought even more dramatic improvements to our departmental performance. I developed a proprietary analytical framework that could predict supply chain disruptions with 86% accuracy, allowing our clients to implement preventive measures rather than reactive fixes. This innovation alone saved our client base over $12 million in the first quarter of implementation. I also identified an opportunity to expand our service offerings into compliance consulting, an area where many of our manufacturing clients were struggling with increasingly complex regulatory requirements. I spent weeks developing a comprehensive proposal outlining the market opportunity, required resources, and projected revenue impact. The numbers were compelling. We could potentially double our annual revenue within 18 months while significantly improving our value proposition to existing clients. Marcus's response to this proposal was the clearest indication yet that our relationship had fundamentally changed. He spent nearly an hour reviewing my work, asking detailed questions about methodology and implementation strategies. His technical questions were sophisticated enough to demonstrate that he understood the value of what I was proposing. But his final response was that the timing wasn't right for this kind of expansion, that we needed to focus on perfecting our existing service delivery before considering new offerings. This reasoning might have been acceptable if our existing service delivery hadn't already reached industry-leading levels of effectiveness. Our success rates had continued to climb, reaching 81% by the end of the second year. Client satisfaction scores averaged 4.7 out of 5, and our contract renewal rate had improved to 93%. We weren't struggling with execution. We were actually operating at capacity and regularly having to decline new client opportunities because we lacked the bandwidth. I began to suspect that Marcus was less concerned about departmental capacity than he was about departmental control. My success was creating a situation where his value as a manager was becoming increasingly questionable. I was generating the strategic insights, developing the innovative solutions, and building the client relationships that were driving our success. Marcus was essentially functioning as a messenger, carrying my work to senior leadership and taking credit for departmental achievements that he had minimal involvement in creating. This suspicion was confirmed during the third year when I discovered that Marcus had been presenting my compliance consulting proposal to senior leadership as his own strategic initiative. I learned this through Sarah Martinez, a director in the finance department who'd been asked to provide budget projections for the proposed expansion. She mentioned in passing how impressed she'd been with Marcus's innovative thinking and asked if I was excited about supporting his new project. The revelation was professionally devastating, but it also clarified the situation in a way that allowed me to begin planning my response. Marcus wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was actively preventing me from receiving recognition for innovations that could have significantly advanced my career. He was using his position as my manager to create a professional glass ceiling that protected his own authority while limiting my growth potential. I spent the next several months operating with a new level of strategic awareness. I continued to perform at the same high level, continued to generate innovative solutions, and drive exceptional results. But I also began documenting everything with the kind of meticulous detail that would make an attorney proud. Every email, every report, every client interaction was archived and categorized. I created a comprehensive portfolio that demonstrated not just my contributions to departmental success, but my specific innovations and their measurable impact on company performance. I also began cultivating relationships with senior leadership that didn't require Marcus as an intermediary. Nothing obvious or political, just the kind of professional networking that happens naturally when you're delivering exceptional results. I made sure to include detailed attribution in all my reports, clearly identifying which analyses and recommendations originated from my work. I started copying relevant executives on client communications that showcased successful project outcomes. Most importantly, I began preparing for the conversation I knew was coming. Marcus's behavior had become increasingly erratic as my profile within the company continued to grow despite his efforts to contain it. He'd started scheduling more frequent one-on-one meetings where he'd subtly remind me about proper channels of communication and the importance of letting him handle senior leadership relationships. He'd begun editing my reports more heavily, often removing specific details about methodology or innovative approaches that clearly demonstrated advanced analytical capabilities. The breaking point came when James Rodriguez, the regional director, mentioned during a company-wide meeting that he'd been impressed by some recent innovative thinking in the operations department and asked if I could present my compliance consulting framework to the executive team. Marcus's face went through several distinct color changes as he realized that his attempt to claim ownership of my work was about to be exposed in the most public way possible. That's when I heard the phone conversation that confirmed everything I'd suspected about Marcus's perception of me and my role in the department. Overqualified and threatening. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes, and I heard enough to understand that Marcus was actively lobbying for my removal from the department. He was arguing that my salary was too high for the value I provided, that my analytical approach was unnecessarily complex, and that my presence was creating management challenges that were affecting departmental efficiency. The timing of this conversation was particularly interesting because it occurred just 2 weeks before my scheduled presentation to the executive team about the compliance consulting opportunity. Marcus had clearly realized that this presentation would expose the true source of the strategic thinking that had been driving our departmental success, and he was attempting to have me removed before that revelation could occur. But here's where being genuinely overqualified for your position becomes a significant advantage. I'd been anticipating this exact scenario for months, and I'd spent considerable time preparing for it. The documentation I'd been accumulating wasn't just a defensive measure. It was the foundation for a comprehensive case that would demonstrate not just my value to the company, but the extent to which my contributions had been systematically misrepresented. I spent the weekend following the overheard phone conversation preparing a presentation that would serve dual purposes. On the surface, it would be the compliance consulting framework that James had requested. But embedded within that presentation would be a complete demonstration of my analytical capabilities, my strategic thinking, and my understanding of the company's operational challenges and opportunities. I also prepared a separate document that would only be shared if necessary. This document contained a detailed timeline of my contributions to departmental success, complete with supporting evidence that clearly demonstrated which initiatives, innovations, and strategic insights had originated from my work. It included client testimonials, performance metrics, and financial impact analyses that would make it impossible for anyone to question my value to the organization. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, with the full executive team in attendance. Marcus spent the preceding week trying to insert himself into my preparation process, suggesting that we should present the framework together as a collaborative departmental initiative. I politely but firmly declined these suggestions, explaining that James had specifically requested that I present my work and that changing the format might create confusion. On the morning of the presentation, I arrived at the office to find an email from Marcus requesting an emergency meeting before the executive presentation. The email was professionally worded, but carried an undertone of desperation that confirmed my suspicions about his state of mind. He was realizing that the presentation would expose the gap between his claimed contributions and his actual involvement in our departmental success. The meeting took place in Marcus's office at 9 a.m., 1 hour before my scheduled presentation to the executive team. Marcus was visibly agitated, though he was attempting to maintain a facade of managerial authority. He started by expressing concerns about the complexity of my presentation, suggesting that the executive team might not have the technical background to understand some of the analytical frameworks I developed. He then shifted to discussing what he called departmental messaging consistency, arguing that it was important for all external communications to reflect our collaborative approach to problem solving. He suggested that we modify the presentation to include more references to team-based decision-making and shared responsibility for the innovations I'd be discussing. I listened to these suggestions with the kind of professional courtesy that had served me well throughout my career, but I also made it clear that I wasn't planning to make any substantial changes to the presentation. I explained that the framework was based on my specific analytical approach and that diluting the technical content would undermine its effectiveness. I also pointed out that James had specifically requested that I present my work, which suggested that he was interested in understanding my individual contributions rather than generic departmental capabilities. Marcus's response to my polite refusal was the most revealing moment of our entire professional relationship. The carefully maintained facade of supportive management disappeared, replaced by a level of frustration and anxiety that made it clear how threatened he felt by my presence in the department. He began speaking more rapidly, his voice taking on a tone that bordered on desperation. He started by questioning whether I fully understood the potential career implications of positioning myself as the sole source of our departmental innovations. He suggested that taking too much individual credit could be perceived as undermining team collaboration and might reflect poorly on my ability to work within established organizational structures. Then he shifted to discussing what he called realistic career expectations, pointing out that the company had specific advancement pathways that required demonstrated loyalty to immediate supervisors and respect for established hierarchies. He implied that my approach to the upcoming presentation might be perceived as overly ambitious and could potentially damage my long-term prospects with the company. Finally, he delivered what was clearly intended as a professional threat, disguised as mentorship advice. He reminded me that my performance reviews were ultimately his responsibility, and that my future with the company would be significantly influenced by his assessment of my teamwork and collaborative skills. He suggested that the executive presentation represented an opportunity to demonstrate these qualities by acknowledging the departmental support that had made my work possible. I responded to this thinly veiled attempt at intimidation with the same professional courtesy I'd maintained throughout the meeting. I thanked him for his feedback and assured him that I would keep his concerns in mind during the presentation. I also made it clear that I was confident in my ability to represent both my individual contributions and the supportive departmental environment that had enabled my success. The presentation itself was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room, with the full executive team in attendance. James Rodriguez was there, along with the CEO Patricia Wong, CFO Michael Stevens, and Head of Operations Jennifer Kim. Marcus was also present, sitting at the far end of the conference table with an expression that suggested he was preparing for a professional execution. I started with a brief overview of the current compliance landscape in manufacturing, outlining the regulatory challenges that were creating operational headaches for our clients. I then presented the analytical framework I'd developed for predicting compliance risks, demonstrating how this approach could help clients avoid costly violations while improving their overall operational efficiency. The executive team's response was immediately positive. They asked sophisticated questions about methodology, implementation timelines, and resource requirements. They were particularly interested in the financial projections, and I was able to provide detailed analysis showing how the compliance consulting service could generate significant revenue while strengthening our relationships with existing clients. About halfway through the presentation, Patricia Wong asked a question that I'd been expecting and preparing for. She wanted to know about the developmental timeline for the framework, specifically how long it had taken to create and what resources had been required. This was the moment when the true scope of my individual contributions would become apparent to the executive team. I explained that I'd been developing the framework over the past 18 months, working primarily during evenings and weekends to avoid impacting my regular analytical responsibilities. I outlined the research process, the data collection methodology, and the validation testing that had been required to achieve the current level of accuracy. I also provided specific examples of how the framework had already been successfully applied to solve compliance challenges for 3 of our existing clients. The executives were clearly impressed by both the technical sophistication of the work and the initiative I'd shown in developing it without being asked. Jennifer Kim commented that this kind of innovative thinking was exactly what the company needed to maintain its competitive edge in an increasingly complex market environment. That's when James Rodriguez asked the question that would ultimately determine Marcus's fate within the company. He wanted to know more about the departmental support structure that had enabled this kind of innovation, specifically asking about Marcus's role in encouraging and facilitating my work on the compliance framework. I could see Marcus's face go pale as he realized that this question would expose the gap between his claimed leadership role and his actual involvement in the project. I chose my words carefully, providing an honest but diplomatic response that acknowledged the departmental environment while making it clear that the compliance framework had been an individual initiative. I explained that I'd kept Marcus informed about my progress on the project and that he'd been supportive of my efforts to expand our service capabilities. I also made it clear that the technical development work had been entirely my responsibility and that I'd chosen to pursue the project based on my analysis of market opportunities and client needs. This response created a moment of obvious tension in the room. The executives were clearly doing the mental math, recognizing that a major strategic innovation had been developed by an individual contributor working independently rather than as part of a manager-directed initiative. The implications for departmental leadership and resource allocation were apparent to everyone present. Patricia Wong asked a follow-up question about other recent innovations in the operations department, specifically mentioning the supply chain disruption prediction model that had been generating such impressive results for our clients. I provided a similar explanation, outlining how I developed the model and implemented it across our client base over the past year. By this point, Marcus was visibly sweating, despite the conference room's air conditioning. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the room. The innovations that had been driving our departmental success were originating from my individual work, rather than from any collaborative leadership process. Marcus's role was being revealed as primarily administrative rather than strategic. The presentation concluded with a discussion of implementation timelines and resource requirements for the compliance consulting expansion. The executive team was enthusiastic about moving forward and asked me to prepare a detailed project plan for review within 2 weeks. They also requested that I take the lead on developing the new service offering, given my expertise in the area and my track record of successful innovation. As the meeting concluded, James Rodriguez asked to speak with me privately about some additional opportunities he wanted to discuss. Marcus was clearly excluded from this conversation, and his expression suggested that he understood the professional implications of this exclusion. The private conversation with James lasted about 20 minutes and covered several topics that would fundamentally change my role within the company. He started by expressing his appreciation for the quality of work I'd been producing and his recognition that my contributions had been driving much of the operations department's recent success. He then outlined a restructuring proposal that would create a new position focused on strategic innovation and client development. This role would report directly to him rather than through the existing departmental hierarchy, and it would include responsibility for leading the compliance consulting expansion, as well as identifying other opportunities for service innovation. The salary and benefits package he described represented a 47% increase over my current compensation, along with equity participation and performance bonuses tied to the success of new service offerings. More importantly, the role would provide the kind of strategic autonomy and recognition that I'd been seeking throughout my time at the company. James also addressed the elephant in the room by acknowledging that there had been some communication challenges within the operations department that were preventing the company from fully utilizing my capabilities. He made it clear that these challenges would be resolved as part of the restructuring process and that I would have direct access to senior leadership for all strategic initiatives. I accepted the position immediately, recognizing that it represented everything I'd been working toward over the past 3 years. The conversation concluded with James scheduling a meeting with HR to formalize the transition and begin the process of implementing the new organizational structure. I returned to my desk to find Marcus waiting for me with an expression that combined anxiety, anger, and resignation in equal measures. He asked about the private conversation with James, and I provided a brief professional summary of the new role I'd been offered. His response was a mixture of congratulations and barely concealed resentment. The next few days were professionally awkward, but ultimately satisfying. Word of my promotion spread quickly through the office, and the response from colleagues was overwhelmingly positive. People who had been working with me for 3 years were finally able to acknowledge openly what they'd known privately, that I'd been operating at a level well above my official position, and that my contributions had been driving much of our departmental success. Marcus's behavior during this transition period was particularly revealing. He alternated between attempts at damage control and transparent attempts to associate himself with my success. He started referring to the compliance consulting framework as something we had developed together, despite having no involvement in its creation. He also began scheduling meetings with senior leadership to discuss his role in mentoring and developing my capabilities. These efforts were largely unsuccessful, primarily because the executive team now had a clear understanding of the actual source of the innovations that had been driving departmental performance. James Rodriguez, in particular, seemed to have lost confidence in Marcus's leadership capabilities and began excluding him from strategic planning discussions. The formal transition to my new role took place over a 2-week period, during which I worked directly with James to develop implementation plans for the compliance consulting expansion. Marcus was involved in these discussions only to the extent necessary to ensure continuity of existing client relationships and departmental operations. The most satisfying moment of this entire process occurred during a department-wide meeting where James announced the organizational restructuring and my new role. He took the opportunity to provide specific recognition for the innovations I developed and their impact on company performance. He also outlined how the new structure would enable better utilization of strategic capabilities and more effective client service delivery. Marcus's face during this announcement was a study in professional defeat. He maintained a facade of supportive leadership, congratulating me on the promotion and expressing enthusiasm for the new organizational structure. But his body language and facial expressions revealed the depth of his realization that his own career prospects had been significantly damaged by his mismanagement of our working relationship. The meeting concluded with questions from departmental staff about how the restructuring would affect their own roles and responsibilities. James made it clear that the changes were designed to enhance everyone's effectiveness and that there would be opportunities for increased collaboration with my new strategic innovation function. After the meeting, several colleagues approached me privately to express their satisfaction with the outcome. They acknowledged that they'd been aware of the tension between Marcus and me and that they'd recognized the unfairness of the situation. They also expressed enthusiasm about the opportunity to work more directly with me on client projects and strategic initiatives. The final confirmation of Marcus's professional downfall came 2 weeks later when James scheduled a private meeting with me to discuss Marcus's future with the company. He explained that the executive team had lost confidence in Marcus's leadership capabilities and that they were considering whether he should remain in a management role. James asked for my assessment of Marcus's performance as a manager, specifically focusing on his ability to recognize and develop talent within his team. I provided an honest but professional evaluation, acknowledging that Marcus had certain administrative strengths while making it clear that his strategic leadership capabilities were limited. I also mentioned that Marcus had seemed to struggle with managing high-performing team members and that this had created some challenges in terms of innovation and professional development. I was careful to avoid personal criticism, focusing instead on specific examples of how management approaches could be improved to better support departmental success. The conversation concluded with James thanking me for my candid assessment and assuring me that any decisions about Marcus's future would be made with careful consideration of departmental needs and company objectives. He also made it clear that my new role would include input on departmental staffing and structure, giving me significant influence over the working environment that had been so problematic under Marcus's leadership. Marcus's departure from the company was announced 3 weeks later as part of a broader organizational restructuring. The official explanation focused on evolving business needs and strategic realignment, but everyone involved understood the real reasons for his removal. His inability to recognize, support, and properly manage high-performing team members had ultimately cost him his career with the company. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Marcus had been so concerned about being threatened by my capabilities that he'd created the exact situation he'd been trying to avoid. His attempts to contain and control my contributions had ultimately led to a reorganization that eliminated his role while significantly expanding mine. My new position as Director of Strategic Innovation has exceeded every expectation I had when I first joined Meridian Solutions. The compliance consulting expansion generated over $3 million in new revenue during its first year of operation, and we've since launched 2 additional service offerings based on analytical frameworks I developed. More importantly, I now have the kind of professional autonomy and recognition that allows me to do my best work without having to navigate the political complexities that had made my previous role so frustrating. I report directly to senior leadership, have input on strategic planning, and am able to develop and implement innovations without having to worry about credit attribution or territorial concerns. The company's performance has continued to improve under the new organizational structure. Our client success rates have reached 87%, and our contract values have increased by an average of 43% as we've expanded our service capabilities. We've also been able to attract higher quality clients who are seeking more sophisticated analytical support for their operational challenges. Looking back on this experience, I'm struck by how predictable the outcome was once I understood the real dynamics of the situation. Marcus's insecurity about his own capabilities made it impossible for him to effectively manage someone whose skills exceeded his own. His attempts to protect his position by limiting my growth ultimately created a situation where senior leadership had to choose between his comfort and the company's success. The lesson I've taken from this experience is the importance of documenting your contributions and maintaining direct relationships with decision makers who can accurately assess your value. In corporate environments, perception often matters as much as performance, and managers who feel threatened by their subordinates' capabilities will sometimes prioritize their own security over organizational success. I've also learned that genuine expertise has a way of making itself known despite attempts to suppress or misrepresent it. The innovations I developed and the results I achieved spoke for themselves in a way that couldn't be hidden or attributed to others indefinitely. Quality work creates its own momentum and ultimately finds its way to people who can recognize and appreciate it. The most satisfying aspect of this outcome isn't the vindication or the career advancement, though both are certainly gratifying. It's the opportunity to do meaningful work in an environment that supports and encourages innovation rather than trying to contain it. I'm now able to use my capabilities to their fullest extent, and the results are benefiting not just my own career, but the entire organization. Marcus's characterization of me as overqualified and threatening turned out to be accidentally accurate, though not in the way he intended. I was overqualified for the position he was trying to keep me in, and my capabilities were indeed threatening to a manager who couldn't effectively utilize or develop the talent he was responsible for leading. The real threat, however, wasn't to the company or to the department's success. The threat was to a management approach that prioritized control over results and personal security over organizational growth. When senior leadership recognized this distinction, the outcome became inevitable. Today, I work with a management philosophy that's based on the lessons I learned from this experience. I actively seek out team members whose capabilities exceed my own in specific areas, and I focus on creating an environment where their expertise can flourish rather than trying to contain or control it. The results speak for themselves. Our team consistently delivers innovations that drive measurable business value, and our individual contributors are regularly promoted to leadership roles throughout the company. The professional vindication I experienced wasn't about revenge or personal satisfaction, though I won't pretend those elements weren't present. It was about the recognition that organizations succeed when they properly identify, develop, and utilize the capabilities of their people. Marcus's failure wasn't just a failure of individual leadership. It was a failure to understand this fundamental principle of effective management. The meeting with James Rodriguez that left Marcus trembling wasn't a moment of triumph for me. It was a moment of professional clarity for the organization. Senior leadership finally had a complete picture of the dynamics that had been affecting our departmental performance, and they made the decisions necessary to optimize our collective success. In the end, the most important outcome of this experience has been the opportunity to build something meaningful rather than just surviving in a situation that was limiting my potential. The innovations we've implemented have helped our clients improve their operations, reduce their costs, and avoid regulatory problems that could have been devastating to their businesses. That's the kind of professional legacy I want to create. Not just personal success, but contributions that make a meaningful difference for the organizations and people I work with. Marcus's attempt to contain my capabilities ultimately led to an outcome that allowed those capabilities to flourish in ways that benefit everyone involved. The corporate world is full of stories about talented individuals who are held back by insecure managers or organizational dysfunction. My experience suggests that while these situations can be professionally frustrating, they don't have to be career-limiting if you approach them strategically and maintain focus on delivering exceptional results. Quality work creates its own opportunities, and organizations that want to succeed will eventually recognize and reward the people who are driving their success. The key is to remain professional, document your contributions, and be prepared to demonstrate your value when the opportunity arises. Marcus learned this lesson the hard way, but it's a lesson that applies to anyone in a leadership position. Your job as a manager isn't to protect yourself from the capabilities of your team members. It's to amplify those capabilities in service of organizational success. When you understand and embrace this principle, everyone wins. When you don't, you end up being the obstacle that needs to be removed for progress to continue. The experience has made me a better leader and a more strategic thinker about organizational dynamics. I now understand that professional success isn't just about individual capabilities. It's about finding or creating environments where those capabilities can be fully utilized. Sometimes that means working within existing structures, and sometimes it means being patient while those structures evolve to accommodate what you have to offer. In my case, the evolution happened faster than I expected, primarily because the gap between my contributions and my recognition had become too obvious for senior leadership to ignore. But the underlying principle remains the same. Focus on delivering exceptional results, maintain your professional integrity, and trust that quality work will ultimately be recognized and rewarded. The phrase overqualified and threatening will always remind me of this experience, but it no longer bothers me the way it did when I first heard it. I've come to understand that these characteristics are only problems in environments that can't effectively manage and utilize advanced capabilities. In the right organizational context, being overqualified means you can solve problems that others can't, and being threatening means you can drive changes that create competitive advantages. The key is finding or creating the right context for your capabilities and being prepared to demonstrate their value when the opportunity arises. My experience at Meridian Solutions proved that this approach works even in situations that initially seem hopeless or professionally limiting. The trembling Marcus experienced during that final meeting with James wasn't just about losing his job. It was about the realization that his approach to management had been fundamentally flawed. He'd spent 3 years trying to contain something that could have made his entire department more successful, and when senior leadership finally understood what had been happening, the consequences were swift and decisive. That's the real lesson of this story. Leadership is about enabling success, not preventing it. When you understand this principle and apply it consistently, you create environments where everyone can do their best work. When you don't, you create the conditions for your own professional failure. I'm grateful for the experience, even though it was frustrating while it was happening. It taught me important lessons about organizational dynamics, strategic thinking, and professional resilience that have served me well in my current role. Most importantly, it reinforced my belief that quality work and professional integrity will ultimately prevail over political maneuvering and insecure management. The success I've achieved in my new role validates this belief and provides a foundation for continued growth and contribution. The innovations we've implemented, the results we've achieved, and the recognition we've received all demonstrate that the right approach to talent management creates value for everyone involved. Marcus's departure from the company was ultimately beneficial for everyone, including Marcus himself. He's now in a role that better matches his capabilities and management style, and our department is able to operate with the kind of strategic focus and innovation that drives exceptional results. The whole experience reinforced my conviction that professional vindication isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right through consistent excellence and strategic thinking. When you maintain this focus, the outcomes tend to take care of themselves in ways that benefit everyone involved. That's the approach I continue to take in my current role, and it's the approach I recommend to anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation. Focus on delivering exceptional results, maintain your professional integrity, and trust that quality work will ultimately create the opportunities you're seeking. The vindication you experience will be all the more satisfying because it's based on genuine contributions, rather than political maneuvering or personal conflicts. The corporate world needs more leaders who understand these principles and fewer managers who are threatened by the capabilities of their team members. My experience suggests that organizations are increasingly recognizing this need and making the changes necessary to create more effective and supportive working environments. That's ultimately the most important outcome of this entire experience: the opportunity to contribute to this positive evolution in corporate culture and management philosophy. The innovations we've implemented and the results we've achieved provide a model for other organizations that want to better utilize the capabilities of their people. The phrase that once represented professional frustration has become a reminder of the importance of finding the right environment for your capabilities and being prepared to demonstrate their value when the opportunity arises. In the right context, being overqualified and threatening are exactly the characteristics that drive exceptional results and create lasting value for everyone involved.